So good morning, everybody. This is our fourth session of the fall semester, our fourth and last session of the fall semester. And we are thrilled that we have Professor Jonathan Sarna with us, who we'll introduce in a few minutes. Hi, Talia, now I see your face. So I wanted to start this morning, as we often do, we always do, with a Hineni moment for everyone to sort of take a minute to be present. I'm going to share my screen also to show a little, hold on, whoops. Is that sharing? Is that sharing? Okay, so I chose this image this morning because I'm sure, as everybody knows, today is the winter solstice. And yes, December 21st, and the reason I thought about this for our Hineni moment this morning is we are halfway through the darkest part of the year. And it's just an amazing thing for us all that we've been, living like this, working like this for so long. And of course, there's so many bright spots along the horizon at this point. And I just thought if everyone could take a minute and sort of let go of all that darkness that we've had until now and think for a minute about the light that is about to come in the coming months. And certainly as of tomorrow, the sun's going to start setting a little earlier and we'll have that much more daylight each day. So that's my thought for this morning. And I am going to turn the session over to Michael. I think I should have just stopped sharing. And I need to get his poem up. So Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you while I get that ready.
Great. Thank you, Marion. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be with you at this kind of end of the semester. Everyone's been working very, very hard, and it's been a truly extraordinary time for all of us. And we have our distinguished guest, Professor Sarna, with us this morning, and I don't want to take time away from what I know is going to be very exciting and really inspirational contribution. So, but basically in the same spirit as Marion, I just want to give us a kavanah, an intention, an opening for us to set the scene for why history is so important for us in this current moment. We're all actually living through a moment in history. This is history in the making, and what can we learn from our own times? It's been a very hard year with the pandemic, and also in our country with the election and everything that's been connected to that very difficult and harsh reality that's been part of our work in this area, as well as, of course, the global conflicts continue, whether it's with the Rohingya peoples or the Uyghur peoples in China. So we have this human species that continues not to sit comfortably with each other. And so I wanted to offer a poem of hope, a poem that comes from the Irish poet Seamus Heaney. Apparently this is Joe Biden's favorite poem as well. So I thought it was appropriate to quote it this morning, and in honor of Jonathan's work as the preeminent Jewish historian for our country, and everything we have to learn from history as we live through it. So Marion, if you want to share it, then everybody can follow it along, and I'll read it out.
I thought I was sharing. Let me see. Hold on.
It was, and then it disappeared.
How about now?
Here we go. Thank you. You may want to close your eyes for this. Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up. And hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call miracle self-healing, the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain, or lightning and storm, and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of new life at its term. It means once in a lifetime that justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. Thank you. Good morning.
Thank you, Michael, and really a lovely tribute to Jonathan's topic and to, of course, Joe Biden, President-elect Joe Biden. Thank you very much. So now it is absolutely my pleasure to introduce, and I hope he doesn't really need much introduction in our group, Professor Jonathan Sarna. Those of us here locally in Boston know Jonathan well from all of his work in the community, and obviously as a preeminent, as Michael said, the preeminent scholar of American Jewish history. And we are fortunate that Jonathan makes his home here with us in Boston, and of course his academic home at Brandeis. And we are so thrilled that he has agreed to share with us this morning on the topic of Jews in the public sphere in America. And he's going to share some interesting learning with us about the prayer for the welfare of our country, and the welfare of the president. And many of you may use Jonathan's book in your schools. I think everyone knows that he, with our other colleague, Jonathan Krasner, wrote a children's textbook on Jewish history. So I'm sure many of you not in the Boston area are familiar with him that way, and also, of course, from all of his work in American Jewish history. So Jonathan, I'm going to turn over to you. And do you want me to share my screen already with your PowerPoint?
Sure. Thank you. It's nice to be with everybody. On the shortest day of the year. It's good for one of the shortest people. I should say I'm a graduate of the Hebrew College, a proud alum of both the Prosdor and the college. So whenever Hebrew College invites me to do something, I try and say yes, and really a pleasure to be with some of you I know, and some of you I hope I'll get to know. And indeed, the question really is, we're about to inaugurate a new president. What do Jews do? And the prayer for the government, it seemed to me, really very much is in the public sphere. And how do we respond liturgically to a government? And after all, it may be a government, I know it's hard to imagine, but it may be a government we don't like. How do Jews respond to a government which we're not happy with? It turns out that this is a very old problem. Let's go to the next slide, please. All the way back in Jeremiah, Jews are suddenly in the diaspora, a new experience, and Jeremiah gives them some advice. And it's not intuitive advice. You might think we should curse the city to which we've been exiled and pray for its demise. But actually, Jeremiah says the opposite. This is a very conservative view. Seek the welfare of the city to which I've exiled you. Pray to the Lord in its behalf. In Hebrew, ki bishloma yeh lachem shalom. In the prosperity, in the welfare of the city, that will be good for Jews as well. If it's good for the community, and this is directly, if it's to the point of this session, if it's good for the larger community, it will be good for the Jews. Social tension, tumult in the larger community is bad for the Jews. And this was a piece of wisdom that Jews internalized. Note well, by the way, that Jeremiah talks about praying for the city, for the community. Doesn't say anything about the leaders. No,
Sorry.
stay back where we were. Go back
Yeah,
where we were, please.
I'm sorry.
It doesn't say anything about the leaders, but you'll see it's hard to distinguish a community from its leaders. I'll just go through other texts that talk about this. Ezra is quite explicit. King Darius in English, has reiterated the order to build the temple and makes clear that in addition to sacrifices in the Beit HaMikdash, he expects prayers for the life of the king and his sons. So we have a kind of very early sense that part of what we do in synagogue is pray for the leaders. Now, the book of Baruch, which many of you may not have heard of, it's not well known. It's an apocryphal book, not important. What happened? Why did
I'm sorry. Wait,
we're
sorry.
losing?
Hold on. Sorry about that.
Well, I'll talk about Baruch while you try and find him. It was an apocryphal book. He got lost from the Bible too. The book of Baruch. No, it's not back. Got eaten. The book of Baruch. There we go. Is interesting because look who it tells us to pray for. Nebuchadnezzar. Hardly a Jewish hero. You might not expect that we should be praying for Nebuchadnezzar. We should curse Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, he never became, nobody here ever met a Jewish child named Nebuchadnezzar Cohen. Nebi. We hate Nebuchadnezzar. Nevertheless, the book of Baruch teaches, and you'll see why I put it in here in a minute, that he should be prayed for. And perhaps the most famous rabbinic text, which relates really to the public sphere, Rabbi Hanina Skana Kohanim Omer, this from the Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, Hevei mitpalel b'shloma shel malchut, she'ilmalei mora'a ish et re'ehu chayim bla'o. This is really a Hobbesian view of the world before Hobbes. The Ethics of the Fathers says, pray for the welfare of the government. And the context here is Rome, not a government Jews like too much. Nevertheless, the rule is we pray for a government because without government, there would be anarchy. I have to tell you, the anarchists who believed that in their natural state everyone would get along, think Kropotkin, the great anarchist, who used to study ants and bees because they cooperated. They thought if only we did away with government, human beings would get along. But that's not what Rabbi Hanina believed. He believed any government is better than no government. Note carefully that we've moved from talking about the community to talking about the government, but actually they are linked, and we all in a way know that from what we see around us. You can't disentangle the government from its leaders, and I dare say anyone who looked at what happened in Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq knows how much truth there is. The absence of a government, even the absence of a very bad government, may be something even worse. Now, the fact that we are enjoined by all of these texts to pray to government does not mean that we have to like the government. Those were totally disentangled in the Jewish mind. And in fact, it's easy to show that Jews from ancient Babylon to the contemporary Soviet Union and Iran pray fervently for governments that they actually despise. And they do that with a clear conscience because that's what we were taught to do. But having talked about a kind of seemingly conservative tradition, next slide, please. I want to move to what I like to call a subversive tradition that has allowed us to fulfill our obligation for the ruler and then quietly make clear what we really think of the ruler. We Jews are really virtuosos given our diaspora history in what the great philosopher Leo Strauss called persecution and the art of writing. And you can see that tradition marvelously preserved in Fiddler on the Roof. You remember the line, Leibush asks, "Is there a proper blessing for the Tsar?" And the rabbi answers, "A blessing for the Tsar? Of course. May God bless and keep the Tsar far away from us." We all know that. But you may say, well, but that's fiction. What kind of a historian uses fiction as an example? But actually, it's drawn from the realia of Jewish life. Next slide, please. This is an amazing text, really. It's a Russian prayer book. Those of you whose Hebrew is good will see that this is the prayer for the government uttered for one of the most hated figures in the early 20th century, Tsar Nicholas and his wife Alexandra. I'm able to date the prayer because it also mentions their son. He was a hemophiliac. He needed prayers. Alexei, and he was only born in 1904. So this is the first decade or so, somewhere between 1904 and 1914, probably, is this text. And you can see this is the traditional prayer for the government. I'll have much more to say about it in a minute, but you can see in big letters it asks God to elevate and respect and honor and all the rest Nikolai Alexandrovich, who so many Jews escaped Russia to America because of his persecutions and pogroms. But why do I want to show this to you? Because of a tiny footnote. We historians like footnotes. You will see, I don't think I have a pointer, but does this show up on your screen? No?
No.
Oh, yeah? Oh, okay. Right there in the top left, there is a little asterisk, and it leads you to the bottom, and at least on my screen, it's too small to see.
Sorry, I was trying to get it.
Can you get it right at the bottom? But you're making progress. Otherwise, I will read it for you. The footnote explains why we pray for the government. And you might have imagined that the footnote would quote Jeremiah or the Ethics of the Fathers or maybe Ezra, but it doesn't. The footnote instead quotes Baruch. It reads, Baruch ben Neriah, Katav me Hagolal Yoshvei Yerushalayim. He wrote from the diaspora to the people of Jerusalem, Lehitpalel al Chaye Nebuchadnezzar, to pray for Nebuchadnezzar, Melech Bavel, Ubelshazzar Bono, Ki Yirbu Yamim Ki Mea Shamayim ala Aretz, that their days should be lengthened and so on. Now, what's going on was he didn't know Jeremiah. He didn't know the ethics of the fathers. All he knew was the book of Baruch. That doesn't seem very likely. Instead, who is he comparing the czar to? He is really comparing the czar tacitly, so obliquely that the censor didn't catch it. He is comparing the czar to Nebuchadnezzar. This is exactly what we see in Fiddler on the Roof. Overtly, we celebrate Nicholas. Covertly, quietly, we say what we really think. He's Nebuchadnezzar. And by the way, I've seen this in my own lifetime. Jimmy Carter was not so popular in Jewish circles. He's the only Democratic president not to get 50% or more of the Jewish vote since 1928. In 1979, when I lived in Cambridge, there was, I remember, a chazan at Musaf, and he had to say the prayer for the government, and he didn't like the government. So what did he say when he got to that point? He said, Yeromeim v'Ygadel v'Yanaseh Lamala, and he pointed up towards heaven as if to suggest that his hope was that Jimmy Carter would ascend rapidly. His prayer was not listened to. Jimmy Carter is still with us. But that too was a way of using a prayer simultaneously, fulfilling what the sages told us, and yet subversively kind of saying what you really think. So, but now I want to show you, if we can go to the next slide, that the prayer itself is a subversive prayer. Those of you, I don't know how many of you say the traditional Jewish prayer for the government. I say traditional. You won't find it before about the 16th century. There were many prayers, but not a fixed prayer. It's a very interesting prayer. And the reason I think this prayer caught on and became the prayer is because it's such a clever and subversive prayer at once. It should immediately attract your attention that this prayer begins in a weird way. Who ever heard of a prayer that begins, Hanotein Shua Lamlachim? How do our prayers start? Avinu Shabashamayim, Elokeinu Elokei Avotenu, Baruch Atah. Who ever heard of a prayer that starts, Hanotein Shua Lamlachim, he who gives dominion to kings? No prayer starts that way, as far as I know, except this one. That's always a sign something is going on. And it's always a good thing to go back and look at the original biblical text. They knew their Bible way back then, and you can often learn a lot by going back and seeing what did the original text say in the Bible. Hanotein Shua Lamlachim comes from Psalm 144, verse 10. Jews actually knew that psalm pretty well because it was the custom to recite it right after Shabbat, or I should say right before Mariv on Motzei Shabbat. It's still there in many traditional prayer books. but this is what I want you to see. The verse begins and our prayer begins. Hanoten shu'al amlachim, hapotzet David avdo mecherev ra'ah. He who gives salvation to kings, who delivers David from the hurtful sword. But what about the next verse? Not in our prayer, but in the minds of Jews who said it. The next verse reads, rescue me, deliver me from the hand of strangers whose mouths speak vanity, and their right hand is the right hand of falsehood. In other words, if you knew your Bible, when you were saying to the king, he who gives delivery to, he who gives salvation to kings, you were thinking the next verse too. You were thinking that context. That's how texts work. You can use them playfully, or I would say subversively, and they did. And actually, I won't go through it now because we'll never end, but I could go verse by verse here and show you that there are kind of what we might call esoteric readings, secret readings, where you seem to be saying one thing, but if you look at the context, they're actually saying the opposite. Why don't we do just one more? I think I have one more slide on it. Next slide, please. The verse ends. It's almost cut off. Uvalet Zion Goel, v'chein yehi ratzon, meaning that there will be a redeemer to Zion, a very famous line from Isaiah. But take a look what Isaiah is promising in his original text. He's promising vengeance. He's promising Chemal Tzarav, Gemul Oivav, and so on, and recompense, and they'll repay according to their deeds. In other words, yes, Jews are looking hopefully for redemption, but quietly they were thinking of the revenge and recompense that they might receive. So this is a rare example of really a subversive prayer. It can be read both ways, and that's because Jews had different kinds of governments. There is a manifest reading, and there is a esoteric subversive reading, and the prayer works in either direction, which is astonishing, and allowed Jews in the public sphere to seem to be deeply patriotic, both when they were, but also when they had other views. All right. Let me come to my neck of the pond, my side of the pond. I work, as you heard. Next slide, please, in American Jewish history. The prayer comes to America. This is its first mention in an early text when American colonial Jews are happy that the French and Indian War has been won by England. And that's the first printing of Hanoten Shua in America. But let's go to the next, which in many ways is more interesting. This is a picture of the very first American prayer book, the so-called Jackson prayer book. It's in 1826. And it reminds us that the prayer for the government has come to America. But on the other hand, there was a lot of questioning. Should we be saying this prayer, a prayer for kings in a republic? How does the change in the outer world, public world, affect the inner world of the Jewish community. And I will point out a few things here. First of all, unlike the prayer for the Tsar and all of the European prayers, even in England to this day, ask Rabbi Dr. Shire, you'll see in America after the Revolution, the prayer is radically depersonalized. There is no mention of individuals by name. We pray for the office holder, not for the person. And there's a very subtle but important difference. After you cease to be an office holder, you become a private citizen like everybody else. There is no personality cult such as that which surrounded the king, and note how the prayer reflects that by being depersonalized. Second of all, I had mentioned it, but in the colonial period, Jews used to read out the names of all the high and mighties in Portuguese. Sephardic Jews considered Portuguese an almost chosen language. After the revolution, they shift to English, and you can see the English here, the president, the vice president, and so forth. And second and third, although the tradition doesn't last, after the revolution, at least in New York, at Sheikh Israel, the oldest congregation, Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, the custom was introduced to sit during the prayer for the government rather to stand, because everybody is now equal. That custom, maybe sadly, doesn't last. We tend to stand for the prayer for the government in many congregations. But now I want you to see one other fascinating thing on this text, and that is that it distinguishes between what we say when Congress is in session and what we say when Congress is in recess. It's a good day to say, and Congress is going into recess today. They felt when, of course, the recess was much longer in early America. When Congress is in recess, they don't pray for them, underscoring the idea that we're praying for Congress when it's meeting. Otherwise, they're just private citizens, and we don't have to pray for them. It's really a fascinating thing, and kind of a balance that Jews made in their liturgy, reflecting a sense that our leaders are just like us. And we don't pray for them. We only move and pray when they're actually exercising leadership functions. Now, you may believe this prayer, and I haven't devoted lots of attention, but it's a prayer in which we really elevate the king, and Jews are very humble before a king, that this prayer is an inappropriate one for a democracy and a republic. And if you think that, you're not alone. The very earliest reform movement, known as the Charleston Reform Movement, next slide please, when they publish a new prayer book in 1830, is their prayer book, they write a totally new prayer. And note what they want to do in this prayer. They depict a God who influences America for good, rather than a God who exalts monarchs and inclines their heart to treat Jews mercifully. This prayer, of course, is entirely in English. It's a very American prayer. It doesn't, quote, exalt the president. It simply asks God to bless, preserve, and most interestingly, enlighten. It wants, it makes the point that our leaders are under God. This is, very different than the way Jews were looking at kings in Hanoten Shua. And this is a very American prayer. It thanks God for numbering us with the inhabitants of this thy much favored land. And no more talk, by the way, of redemption. These folks thought America was, in a way, the promised land. Next is another example of a new, next slide, another example of a new prayer. This one interesting because it's actually in Orthodox prayer books. If you have an Orthodox prayer book from the 19th century, it may very well have this prayer. There's a great irony. I showed once that Max Lilienthal wrote this prayer. When he came to America, he was initially an Orthodox rabbi. He's much more famous when he moves to Cincinnati and becomes a Reform rabbi. But what's interesting about this flowery Hebrew prayer is this, again, is full of Zion in America. It's not a groveling tone and a sense of dependency as in the traditional prayer for the government. This prayer radiates optimism and self-confidence, and it appropriates biblical depictions of the land of Israel, where rain will fall in its due season, and so on, and applies them to America. Now, actually, there is no rainy season in New York. It was very strange. But nevertheless, it's revealing, again here, the depersonalization, the president, the vice president, and so on, not mentioned by name, and it asks for them to be divinely guided. No talk of elevating them. And then it's even more strange, since this was a prayer book meant for the whole country. It's very strange that it has prayers for the governor and mayor of New York, but it shows us that even back in the 1840s, there were Jews who had trouble distinguishing New York from the country at large, and mistakenly thought that New York was a microcosm of all of America or all of American Jewry. Don't make that mistake in your own work. And here, do note that it does end on the same idea of a Redeemer coming to Zion. All of the new prayers, I've only given you two, all of the new prayers in the 19th century have three features in common, which again relate to our theme. First of all, they're identifiably American, whereas Hanoten Shua applied anywhere. The traditional prayer, these prayers all exalt America and in a way distinguish Judaism in America from counterparts in Europe. Second of all, the prayers begin with a prayer for the country, and they only refer to the government later, as if to suggest that it's America rather than any particular leader of America who guarantees Jewish liberty. I remind you, Jeremiah talked of the country, the ethics of the fathers talked of the leader. There's, from then until now, there are prayer books and synagogues that recite what they call a prayer for our country, their prayer books, and synagogues that a prayer for our government. It's usually the same prayer, but those are not identical ideas. And here we see, in a sense, the country comes first, and only afterwards the president. And the third point is that the exaggerated deference to king in the traditional prayer is replaced by a statement of the leader's own subservience to God. We're no longer playing to the vanity of the sovereign or underscoring Jewish powerlessness. The 19th century prayers, by the way, very much like Protestant prayers, emphasize the vulnerability of political leaders, the need for divine guidance. But next slide, but I don't want you to think that nobody said the traditional prayer. This is the most beautiful, I think, of the and influential of the 19th century traditional prayer books. Isaac Leeser's form of prayers. He did one Ashkenazi, one Sephardi. Next slide, please. And you will see in his prayer book the traditional prayer, very nicely printed, beautiful. You had better printing in the 1840s than in the 1890s in Hebrew for complicated reasons. But in any case, this is the traditional prayer. But actually, Isaac Leeser quietly made a change. If I won't do it here, you can go back later. If you go back to the prayer we saw in Russia, it included the line, which some of you will also know from the prayer for the state of Israel, asking that may he, meaning the sovereign, subdue nations under his feet and make his enemies fall before him. Yadber amim tachat raglav. Isaac Leeser thought that was too imperialistic, too militaristic for America, and that line quietly disappears. And very soon, I think it may be on the next slide, you'll also see another point disappearing. This is the well-known Birnbaum prayer book in the 20th century, a very influential prayer book. It looks like the same prayer, but notice it too doesn't have Yadber Amim. It doesn't have you subduing nations, but it also makes another very subtle change. The original change asked God to instill Rahmanut, mercy, into the heads of the sovereign. In America, where rights, rather than Rahmanas, rather than mercy, are supposed to govern the relationship between leaders and led. Yes, we don't depend on the mercy of Donald Trump. We depend on our rights and the Supreme Court. And therefore, Isaac Leeser dropped the word Rahmanut, and the same happened in England. Similarly, where there was a sense that Jews suddenly had rights, they didn't need Rahmanut la'asot tova imanu. So the word dropped. However, do yourself a favor someday and look in the great prayer book of Joseph Hertz, the former chief rabbi of England, one of the great English Hebrew prayer books. Rabbi Hertz, in his prayer book, written in the 1930s, lamented the drop in Rahmanas. He said, no, that's a mistake. We Jews do need mercy, Rahmanas, from our leaders. He gave the example of Germany and argued that we should indeed pray for mercy and not just assume that our rights and they're doing well with us will suffice. This is in a way an interesting question, whether Jews should pray for special mercy, that the president really likes us, or whether that is not necessary. I leave that to you, but I want you to understand that there was a lot of politics and a lot of thinking about the relationship between leaders and led, between Jews and the larger country, when people wrote their prayer for the government. Now let's, well, by the way, how long do we have here, Marianne? I can go on for a long time.
We have 10 more minutes, so.
No, and I want to give people some question. All right, let's very quickly, let's move to the slides here. Let's skip. This is the Reformed text. Older Reformed Jews all know it. Note how different it is from the prayer that I showed you. Again, placing God has to enlighten the leader. The leader is subservient. It's there. That prayer, once very well known, my wife still knows it by heart from growing up, it disappeared in the Vietnam era. It was not appropriate, and it goes away, and today not known. Let's do the next. The next slide. The next prayer, this was written by the great Talmudic scholar Levi Ginsburg and is found in every conservative and reconstructionist prayer book since 1927. It's really the most successful of the non-Orthodox prayers. And the reason it's successful, I think, is that Levi Ginsburg understood better than almost anybody else what the real challenge of America was. He writes, plant among the peoples of different nationalities and faith, love, brotherhood, peace, and friendship, uproot from their hearts all hatred and enmity, all jealousy, and vying for supremacy. The English is non-literal, but still may citizens of all races and creeds forge a common bond in true harmony to banish all hatred and bigotry. This is a timeless American theme down to our own day. Anyone in the Black Lives Matter moment could say that prayer and it sounded current. And I have to look at that. Okay, thank you. But nevertheless, I think that's the reason that prayer has survived. In the Vietnam era, as I say, both Orthodox and non-Orthodox, keep going in Orthodox and non-Orthodox. Next slide. This is the Art Scroll prayer book, the original in 1984. No prayer for the government. It has a little notice in the bottom there that some people say it, but it didn't print it. What we do see is a rapid comeback of the prayer for the government after 9/11. All sorts of rabbis called me personally to find prayers. There was a sense after 9/11, we want to pray for this government, just like everybody put up a flag, those who are old enough to remember, so they wanted to pray. And indeed, a new prayer is added, which we didn't have before. Next slide, please, for American soldiers. Now in the Sac Sidur, people think this prayer must go back to Mount Sinai, but actually it's post 9/11. Even though it's found now in many, many traditional prayer books. More recently, with the rise of Donald Trump, The prayer for the government went into decline, and of course, COVID closed synagogues, so it's not said. But you'll see, next slide, please. One rabbi suggested a prayer that made no mention of the leader at all. It was just a prayer. Hu yivarech et artzot habrit ve'ezracheha. Let's pray for the country and its citizens. Let's not pray for our leaders at all. It didn't catch on, but it's revealing. Next slide, please. The Central Synagogue writes a new prayer, but again, you only get to the leaders in the middle of the prayer, and it's more about governing with wisdom and forbearance than it is about elevating those leaders. The point of all of this is that for your purposes, the prayer for the government is a kind of barometer between America of relations between America and the public sphere and the state. You can see also group confidence and all sorts of important tensions between Jews and government. But I want to close with an insight that I learned from the great American religious historian Martin Marty. He heard that I was working on this, and he gave me an insight that I pass on to you. Governments, he observed tartly, receive the prayers that they deserve. And maybe let's hope that our new government will merit our wholehearted, next slide, and fervent tefillot as we look forward to the inauguration. I'll stop there, and maybe there's time for questions. If not, just shoot me any you have. Sarna@brandeis.edu.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Amazingly inspiring and enlightening and educational as always. So I would love for people to unmute themselves and feel free to, sort of raise your hand visually, and then I'll call on you. Talia.
Yeah, so I'm so fascinated in this thing that people were asking you for, I presume, Orthodox communities for a prayer after 9/11, and that prayer fell into decline under Trump. So in let's say Orthodox communities where, I don't know, the vast majority, let's say, support Trump, did they actually stop saying this prayer?
Well, first of all, I should make clear, I talked to rabbis across the spectrum.
Yep.
I taught at Hebrew Union College early in my career. I have the private email of the head of the Reform, the Conservative, the Orthodox. I talked to them all. They all have the same history as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But Mushket is a modern Orthodox rabbi. So remember, there are modern Orthodox congregations that are less. I know an Orthodox rabbi, I won't say who it is, who told me that he, he's got to mention the president, the vice president, but he does it in one breath. Now you have to remember that when someone was saying about Purim, when we read the book of Esther, there is a tradition of reading all the sons of Haman in one breath. And by reading that president and vice president in one breath, he was doing just what that we did in that prayer for the Tsar. He was saying the right words, but making an allusion to Haman. The question that I was asked, there were people who hated, and I'm not fond of the traditional Orthodox prayer, not appropriate for a republic in my view. And there are some interesting alternatives. I showed you some, but there's also some that were said in World War II and that are found in military prayer books that I have brought to the attention of some rabbis who want to change the prayer. The prayer for the government is not, I don't know, like Shemona Esrei or Shema. It's not in the Bible. It's a very late prayer, and it opens up more opportunity, I think, for making changes.
Other comments, questions, observations?
Somebody's got it. Oh, that's me.
All right. Well, first of all,
so
again,
I do have a comment.
Oh, go ahead, Terry.
I would love to share this talk with my community. And I know it was recorded. Is there a possibility to discuss that?
There, and actually, you'll also find it, slightly geared differently and a bit slower on the Drisha. I gave it a Drisha on the Drisha website. I think it's there now because they have a named lecture, and I gave it. And I did do a scholarly article on the prayer for the government. It's much updated from that, and that was differently slanted, but that appears in two places. Shoot me an email.
Okay.
I'll actually send it to you.
Thank you.
Everyone should know we do post the recordings of these on our website. I usually, when they do get posted, which is usually like within the week, I usually send an email with the link in it. But if you go onto the Hebrew College website, you'll find the recordings of all of these sessions. And Professor Sarna, is it okay? Obviously,
yeah, sure.
We put them
I
there for the educated.
When I stop coming up with this stuff, it's time to retire. But who would what? And there's a good Jewish teaching. You shouldn't keep it to yourself. You're supposed to pass it on to people. I think it's rather nice. Also, in the ethics of the fathers, when people give credit to those from whom they learn, according to the ethics of the fathers, if you plagiarize or don't give credit, you are dochet ha'geula, or the reverse is given, mevi geula la'olam, someone who cites his sources, mevi geula la'olam. So good to bring on the redemption and cite sources, but I'm happy for you to do it. In general, it's not a good thing that Jews just mumble through prayers and don't look at them closely. Those of you who know my late father's book on the Book of Psalms, where he shows you word by word what these Psalms are doing. My father believed Jews zog him. They just say they have no idea what they're talking about. And it would be a good thing to read it carefully. So I say the same.
Wonderful. Well, really, that is the intention of these sessions for sure, and certainly our intentions as educators. And Jonathan, I include you in that as an educator.
I'm certainly an educator. I even got an award from the Hebrew College as an educator. Yeah.
Yes, you did. Yeah. Well, so thank you all. I want to send everybody off with blessings for a restful little break that we're all well deserved of, and to come back renewed and to share these ideas and thoughts with your students and with your faculties and with your communities. And we will convene again at late January. Of course, I'll be sending an announcement of that session. It is on January 25th. And really look forward to seeing you all in 2021. And as the days get longer and the sun continues to give us hope and light. So best to everybody as we start vacation week, and see you all soon. Lovely to see everybody this morning. Jonathan, thank you.
Great to see you.
Right. See you out. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
That was so good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. I'm glad you were here, Talia.
Yeah, I'm so glad I caught it. I love liturgy. I don't know if you know that about. I did my a major research project in rabbinical school on like 19th century American Reform liturgy, and kind of looking at the weekday Amidah and how it got rewritten in various places in terms of like they have instead of like let's go to Israel, it's like Shchon B'kirbecha, like dwell with us here in the diaspora. It's wild.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Stuff.
but
Really.
yeah. Anyway, bye, you
All right.
guys.
You have a good vacation.
Yep. Yeah, this is